Illinois, Mr. Jackson is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Is this the start? CB Chair, what's that? Mr. Speaker, I unanimously consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous materials on the subject of this special order.
Without objection?
For the next 60 minutes, we have a chance to speak directly to the American people on the issue of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress, the constituents we represent, and all Americans. I rise today, Ms. Speaker, to underscore how a failure to lift the debt ceiling would impact low-income Black families' access to health care. On the other side of the aisle, my colleagues are attempting to rip health care coverage away from American peoples through burdensome Medicaid work requirements. Under McCarthy's proposed, more than 10 million people in Medicaid expansion state would be at significant risk of losing coverage, more than 1 to 5 enrollees. Medicaid is a crucial tool to promoting healthcare equality. It covers about 3 in 10 Black Americans, American Indian and Alaskan Natives, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders, non-elderly adults. It's a major source of coverage for people of color and provides financial protection from skyrocketing healthcare costs. Despite what Republicans say, Medicaid work requirements are unnecessary. Most adults already on Medicaid are working. What work requirements do is create new barriers to accessing healthcare equality and quality healthcare. According to the Congressional Budget Office, mandatory work requirements would cause 2.2 million people to lose healthcare insurance in just 1 year. These health care cuts are extreme and have the potential to be catastrophic for vulnerable communities. Medicaid expansions have worked for Americans. Ever since the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, 16.8 million Americans have gained health care coverage because of Medicaid expansion. At least 19,000 lives have been saved as a result. Medicaid expansions have reduced devastating out-of-pocket medical costs that can be debilitating for many families, already struggling to make ends meet. The debt ceiling proposal that Speaker McCarthy has floated would put health care out of reach for many Americans and drive them further into poverty. Medicare enrollees cannot afford this game of partisan politics. Their lives are quite literally depending on it. It is our time to act as a Congress and protect the American people and ensure that everyone has access to quality health care. At this moment, I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Maxine Waters from California.
She's going to recognize me. Madam Chair, right now the United States economy is being held hostage by Speaker McCarthy and extreme MAGA Republicans who have issued a series of radical demands. In their demands, they're saying if they're not met, they have said that they will force the United States government into bankruptcy for the first time in our nation's history. Madam Speaker, this fate is exactly 16 days away. The clock is ticking, and instead of taking action to avoid this fate, Republicans are doubling down on their threats, while communities everywhere will suffer enormous harm. No community will bear the brunt of this looming economic catastrophe more than the Black community. A default on our nation's debt will discontinue crucial programs like Medicare, Social Security. In my district alone, a default will jeopardize Social Security payments for 59,000 families and threaten the retirement savings of 89,600 people near retirement. A default will dramatically increase borrowing costs for auto, home, and personal loans and hinder access to credit for Black communities who are already paying more for credit because of predatory lending practices, which still list today. For example, a default would increase mortgage interest rates above 8% and increase monthly mortgage payments on a medium home in California by $254, pushing the total cost of home ownership up by over $91,000. This would further decimate the American dream of home ownership for far too many families. And while we've made considerable progress in strengthening Black employment under President Biden, a default would significantly reverse this progress by throwing 780,000 people out of jobs, including 7,200 jobs in my district alone. And as with most economic crises, Black Americans will not only bear the brunt of a recession, but will also have the most difficult time recovering, and we've seen this in the past. Let's be very clear. The brinksmanship over our nation's debt is not only a direct attack on our economy, but also on Black communities everywhere. We're running out of time to save our economy and our most vulnerable communities from a crisis of epic proportions. So, I urge my Republican colleagues to put an end to this needless political theater and raise the debt limit as they did 3 times with no problems under twice impeached and indicted former President Donald Trump. Not only must they raise the debt limit, but in the midst of a worsening housing crisis, they must do so without cutting a single penny from the critical housing funds. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative. I would like to now, Madam Speaker, I'd like to pass it to my co-anchor, Representative Jonathan Jackson from Illinois.
Thank you, Congresswoman McCormick. I'd like to thank my esteemed colleague, Congresswoman Maxine Waters. I rise today in the chamber of this hallowed institution to raise my voice, echoing the deep concerns that reverberate from the hardworking, dedicated, and patriotic citizens of this great nation. Specifically, I stand before you to amplify the anxieties of Black Americans who for far too long have been subjected to the harshest winds of economic hardship. Today, we find ourselves on the precipice of a financial abyss, and I must underscore the severe impact that the failure to lift the debt ceiling would have on the lives and livelihoods of Black Americans and their families across this country. Our nation stands on the brink of a financial crisis, our coffers threatening to run dry as soon as June 1st. The hard truth, my colleagues, is that we have already reached our debt limit of $31.4 trillion, yet we have not reached an agreement to raise the ceiling. This failure to act is not just a legislative oversight, it threatens the very fabric of our economy, our society, and most importantly, our people's lives. The debt ceiling, for those unfamiliar, is the total amount of federal government can borrow to meet existing obligations, ranging from Medicare, Social Security, and to loan repayments. And so if we fail to raise this debt limit, we risk default on our national loans, leading to a catastrophic fallout for our credit rating and potentially triggering a deep recession. The ripple effect of such a financial debacle would not only be felt within our borders, but would also potentially destabilize the global economy. Now, you may ask, why should Black Americans be particularly concerned? The answer lies in the cruel and persistent reality of our socioeconomic landscape. A deep recession does not impact all demographics equally. Black Americans are typically among the first to feel the brunt of economic downturns, often being laid off first and tragically the last to recover. A default would strike an even harsher blow to the backbone of Black communities, our elderly. As of 2017, 35% of elderly married Black couples and 58% of unmarried Black older adults depend on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. If the debt ceiling is not lifted and our default on our obligation, and the fallout would disproportionately harm the Black community and shred the already thin safety net many rely upon. The current crisis we face extends beyond Social Security, Medicare, and essential federal services. It reaches into the realm of higher education, ensnaring young Black Americans in the tightening grip of student loan debts. The bill that many of my colleagues across the aisle have brought to the fore would effectively dismantle President Biden's student loan debt relief, a plan that promises to lift the yoke of debt. Those earning less than $125,000 annually, forgiving up to $10,000 in student loan debt, and even more for lower income borrowers. Many of the recipients that receive PPP funds now have become cruel in the face of students. The Republican government arguments that this plan misuses taxpayers' dollars to pardon the debts of some Americans is not just misguided, it is a grievous misrepresentation of the realities faced by our young citizens, particularly those of color. Black college graduates bear the brunt of this student debt crisis. Over 80% of Black bachelor's degree recipients are shackled with an average debt of over $34,000, according to the Institute for College Access and Success. Not only are they borrowing more, and they are also defaulting at higher rates because they are not able to go into higher paying jobs. These are not merely statistics, Ms. Speaker. These are the dreams of our young being crushed under the weight of financial obligations. In the shadow of this impending catastrophe, we ask, why has Congress not acted? It's the same answer that has plagued institutions for centuries: politics. While the Republican-controlled House has passed a bill to raise the debt limit, it's fraught with spending cuts and new work requirements for those receiving government benefits, making it an untenable solution. Over 85% of those persons that are receiving these benefits are now have an elderly person or a child or unable to find public or private transportation to meet these work requirements. We must think of the whole continuum in order to fix the problem and not the blame on the backs of the poor. During the presidency of Donald Trump, Congress raised the debt limit 3 times in 2017, 2018, 2019, with bipartisan support and no precondition on budget cuts. Since 1959, this debt ceiling has been raised 89 times. A financial crisis was averted because both sides across the aisles recognized the need to act swiftly and responsibly to protect the interests of the American people. Now, as we face a similar situation, the Biden-Harris administration has drawn a clear line in the sand. They have rightly insisted that fiscal budgets and the debt ceiling should be separate issues. Again, fiscal budgets and the debt ceiling should be separate issues. The former is a debate about the future. The latter is a commitment to paying our bills for debts we've already incurred. Mixing these two distinct aspects would be akin to confusing our aspirations with our responsibilities. A default would wreak havoc on federal services that Black and brown communities disproportionately rely upon, such as food assistance and Social Security. It would cause the government to prioritize debt payments over the well-being of its citizens. It could cause the government further to lead to a potential default on these critical services. The impact of a default are largely unknown and could be far-reaching, potentially exacerbating existing racial disparities in healthcare, veteran services, and the labor market. A default would also have a chilling effect on the consumer's borrowing costs, with interest rates likely to skyrocket for home, auto, and personal loans. Furthermore, the increased credit risk of the federal government could significantly hinder credit access for communities of color who have already more than likely to have credit reports and credit worthiness according to the credit profiles and the history of redlining. Our nation is at a crossroads. We cannot allow political brinksmanship to lead us into an economic downturn that will disproportionately devastate our most vulnerable communities. A failure to lift the debt ceiling is not just an economic misstep, it is a failure of our collective moral responsibilities to all Americans, especially those who have historically been marginalized and disadvantaged. Black unemployment has been decreasing, and we have made strides towards a stronger, more equitable economy. Yet, if a recession were to happen due to our failure to raise the debt limit, The unemployment rate for Black Americans would rise faster than other demographics. This potential economic downturn threatens to wipe away the progress we've made and plunge us back into inequality and hardships. We must not allow our crisis of our own making to unravel the hard-earned progress of our people. We must raise the debt ceiling, not just because it is economically prudent, but because it is morally right. The dignity and welfare of our people, especially Black families who have far too long borne the brunt of economic hardship, hang in the balance. Let us not act out of fear, but out of hope, not out of division, but out of unity, not out of despair, but out of a belief in the promise of a more equitable and prosperous America for all. Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks. I yield my time back to the Honorable Sheila Surfless McCormick. Chair, pardon me.
The gentleman
yield
yields
my time.
back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Shervillis McCormick, is recognized for the remainder of the hour as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas.
Let me thank the gentlelady from Florida, gentleman from Illinois, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus for gathering us this evening. As I have said often, this is National Police Week. Today we honored those who have fallen in battle. That's why I think this debate on the debt ceiling is so crucial. And it is really important to have the American people recognize, and particularly those impacted in the African American community. As the Congressional Black Caucus rises today to specifically focus on if you will, economic infrastructure around a community that has, in its history in this country, have been deprived of economic wealth and has a wealth disparity between Anglo-Americans of 174,000 versus about 17,000, which leads us to understand how important to have a stable economic structure and for the country to pay its bills. So what is the debt ceiling? It is simply a procedure that has been designated as required for the nation to pay her bills. And every single family, independent, working person, people who are in need understand the need to pay bills. They understand the crisis of not paying bills. And so tonight I just want to briefly discuss some of the challenges that will be faced by poor people, people of color, but also by our law enforcement. Tragically, we see circumstances where law enforcement on the front lines are in jeopardy. And as we see that, we are hearing about who's for the police and who's not for the police. Well, let me tell you what the Default on America bill that has been passed by my Republican friends will do. Frankly, that bill, which is what we're being held hostage for, want to move the Default on America bill before we do the right constitutional and definitively important act of raising the debt ceiling simply to pay the bills, simply to have America continue to be rolling on all wheels, simply to make sure that the military is paid, the massive numbers of law enforcement are paid. So with this bill, the Department of Justice budget will be cut by over $8 billion and threatens nearly 30,000 law enforcement jobs. The Default on America bill cuts nearly $1 billion in grants for state, local, and tribal law enforcement. That includes $150 million in the bill that I wrote, the Violence Against Women Act, and cuts to programs created by the Violence Against Women Act, which will especially harm women in Native communities. The bill cuts $1 billion in FBI funding that the agency uses to conduct background checks to solve violent crimes and combat terrorism. This is protecting individual family members, neighborhoods. By cutting these dollars, you are putting them in jeopardy. It eliminates $564 million in funding by the Drug Enforcement Agency, of which we're trying to stop fentanyl, which, by the way, has been brought in by really U.S. citizens through legal points of entry, and $384 million more from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And we have seen what guns can do to law enforcement officers on the front line. And so I am stunned that we are where we are today. It has already been noted that, in fact, under the past administration, the Trump administration, if I might say, the debt ceiling was raised in a collegiate, responsible way by former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic majority with the Trump administration to do what is right. The only thing that undermined a strong economy was the major deficit and debt that was created by the Trump tax cut. So here we are today, and why I ask, are we in essence being stumbling blocks? Instead of building for eternity, instead of working together, instead of finding a common ground, if we voted today to honor those who have fallen, we'll be voting to honor those who serve. We need to provide those funds to local, state, tribal governments to ensure that we have law enforcement, that the 800,000 police are not diminished, but they're enhanced with skills and training and funding that we're able to do in the federal government. But let me add to making poor people poorer. Food stamps and other nutritional programs will be cut by $14.7 billion in August and September. Pell Grants that cover higher education, which is the underpinnings of creating a new America, an America that is an opportunity for all of us. For low-income students, $8.8 billion. Educational programs designed to improve academic achievement for disadvantaged children, $2.5 billion by August and September. Early childhood development services for low-income children. These are lifelines for these children, be cut by $1.3 billion. All of these are very special and close to my heart, but job training programs for dislocated workers, youth employment services, which directly relate to young people having an opportunity in the summer, not being distracted, not being subjected to potential violence or loss of life because they're not being constructively engaged. $800 million will be cut. And so I am wondering, can we not work together as we did under the Democratic majority, working with a Republican president? Can't we work with a Democratic president and a Republican House and do what is right for the American people and ensure that the poor don't get poorer, and that people of color don't get thrown, not off the rails, but out the train and out the bus to be rolled over? We've got to be able to respond to our early histories, that all of us, many of us know what being poor is, but most of us know what it is to come up with not much, but because of education and opportunities, we are here in this Congress today. I see that in my constituents. I see that in the high schools I go to and the graduating classes that I went to over the weekend, where I saw the graduates who individually had stories where their original beginnings were not the best, but look at them graduating from a business degree in undergraduate school, graduating from law school, graduating with associate degrees, making life better, because part of that was funded by federal resources. We need to raise the debt ceiling, not by being held hostage, but by doing the responsible thing to do, which is to pay America's bill and to make sure that the American people who are pulling themselves up by their bootstraps have the shoes to be able to pull themselves up, and to make sure in this very special week that we honor police officers by providing those local police departments, state departments, tribal departments, the resources that they need, and particularly that we don't underfund the Violence Against Women Act. Some of the most violent calls are domestic violence calls by $150 million, and that we do not take money away from police officers, $8 billion, 30,000 law enforcement officers lost. How outrageous are we going to be? Raise the debt ceiling and do what is right for the American people and our children. I yield back.
Madam Speaker, you've heard from my distinguished colleagues about our topic today, which is raising the debt ceiling, all issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, our constituents, Congress, and all Americans tonight. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Over here.